On a rain-soaked evening in 1847, 4 men sat around a green felt poker table inside Thorngate Manor. Cigars smoked. Bourbon burned. And somewhere in the dark hallways, an enslaved man named Caesar Wellington carried a silver decanter. Knowing his entire life, and the life of his master's daughter, were about to be wagered like chips on the table. What began as a gentleman's game of tobacco, planters soon spiraled into something far more sinister. The stakes weren't money or land or railroads. The stakes were human lives. By the time the last card was turned, one daughter's future had been sold, and one enslaved man had been dealt like a king from the deck. Witnesses would later say they heard screams from the Rutherford estate that night, screams that haunted Virginia for generations. The scandal that followed shattered families, toppled fortunes, and left Thorngate Manor cursed in the eyes of its neighbors. Because in March of 1847, a father didn't just gamble away his wealth. He gambled away his blood. If you're watching this, you care about the buried truths of history. Subscribe now and comment your state or city below. We love hearing where our community of truth seekers is watching from. One card game. One daughter. One enslaved man. The hand that destroyed Virginia. Would you risk your child's life on the turn of a card? In the spring of 1847, Thorngate Manor stood like a crown above Spennsylvania County, Virginia. Its white Georgian columns gleamed even on storm-dark days, and its verandas stretched like arms claiming dominion over the rolling tobacco fields below. 3,000 acres of fertile soil produced some of the South's finest leaves, feeding markets from Richmond to New York. But beneath the grandeur lay the truth. Nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children had built, worked, and suffered to make it so. At the center of this empire was Colonel Harrison Rutherford, age 43. He was a man shaped by power, tall, broad-shouldered, and always dressed in immaculate coats, his gray eyes sharp as a hawk's. His fortune wasn't measured only in acres and profits, but in his influence. He served on the county board, controlled shares in the Richmond and Rappahannock Railroad, and could shift tobacco markets with a single opinion. But of all his possessions, none shone brighter than his daughter, Margaret. Margaret Rutherford was 18, and her beauty was spoken of in whispers across 3 counties. Auburn hair like firelight, green eyes alive with intelligence, a grace refined by French tutors and piano lessons. Suitors from Virginia's most powerful families sought her hand, and Harrison guarded her future with the cold precision of a banker guarding gold. She was not just a daughter, she was a bargaining chip in the empire's survival. And then, there was Caesar Wellington, born on the Rutherford plantation. Caesar was 35, but unlike most enslaved men, he had learned to read, to write, and to count. Quietly, secretly, he had mastered mathematics. Harrison discovered this, and instead of punishing him, used him. Caesar became the plantation's hidden brain, the man who balanced ledgers, tracked debts, even whispered investment strategies. To outsiders, he was property. To Harrison, he was indispensable. Yet this created a dangerous contradiction. In a world where black men were forbidden literacy, Caesar lived in the master's house, not the slave quarters. He had his own room, his own desk, and, though Harrison would never admit it aloud, his own voice in the affairs of the estate. At night, over glasses of brandy, Harrison spoke with Caesar like an equal. But by daylight, Caesar was still expected to bow, to obey, to bear chains of silence. The walls of Thorngate Manor held many such contradictions. Behind its polished mahogany tables and crystal chandeliers, wealth mixed with rot, order with cruelty. The guests who came to play cards in Harrison's study believed themselves untouchable. But within these walls, a storm was brewing, one born of pride, arrogance, and a single deck of cards. It would take only one night, one reckless wager, to turn Thorngate from a kingdom into a grave. 7 Virginia. One plantation, one daughter, one enslaved man whose mind was sharper than any blade, and one game waiting to begin. If you lived in that world, bound by wealth, silence, and chains, whose side would you take, the master guarding his empire, or the enslaved man calculating his way out? Thursday evenings at Thorngate Manor had become ritual. By sunset, the lamps in the study glowed warm against the storm-dark windows. Mahogany shelves groaned with leather-bound books. A Persian rug lay thick beneath a green felt table, and in the fireplace oak logs hissed and spat, filling the room with the scent of smoke and power. This was no ordinary room. It was a stage for men who believed themselves kings of Virginia. Judge Cornelius Peaton arrived first, his carriage wheels dragging mud from the rain-soaked roads. At 62, his thin frame and sharp features carried the weight of law itself. He had helped write Virginia's Constitution, and his judgments could ruin families or restore fortunes. When he stepped into Harrison Rutherford's study, it was not as a guest. It was as a patriarch blessing the game. Next came Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald. Tall, broad, with a physician's cold hands and eyes trained to read men as easily as illness. He owned the neighboring plantation, treated the ailments of Virginia's wealthiest, and never traveled without his black doctor's bag. At the poker table, he played as he practiced medicine, cautiously watching for tells, striking only when certain. The last to arrive was Marcus Bogard, younger, hungrier, and infinitely more dangerous. At 39, he had come north from Charleston with plantations, fortune, and a reputation for risk. Educated in New Orleans, polished in the arts of charm, Bogard carried himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was the kind of man who thrived not in sunlight, but in firelight, where truth could be bent and weakness exposed. "Gentlemen," Marcus declared, shaking rain from his coat, "I trust you're ready for an evening worth remembering." Harrison poured the first round of bourbon. Caesar moved silently through the room, laying out fresh decks of cards, placing crystal glasses within reach, tending the fire. He had done this hundreds of times before, the invisible servant who saw everything but spoke nothing. Yet tonight his hands lingered. His dark eyes studied each man as if measuring their souls. The game began easily. 5-card hands, small bets, laughter about tobacco prices and county gossip. Judge Peaton folded more than he played, content to watch. Dr. Fitzgerald collected modest pots with patience. Harrison found himself in luck, winning steadily, his confidence swelling. And Marcus lost. Hand after hand, he watched his money bleed into the center of the table. By 9 o'clock, the air had shifted. The bourbon burned hotter, the cigars smoked thicker. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smile thinner now, eyes glittering with frustration. He began betting aggressively, his voice louder, sharper, daring the others to meet his recklessness. Harrison welcomed the challenge. Each pot he dragged across the green fed his pride. In that firelit room, with Judge Peaton watching and Caesar serving, Harrison felt invincible. Every card confirmed his power. Every chip piled high on his side was proof that fortune favored him. But under the storm's pounding rain, pride was sharpening itself into a weapon. And Marcus Bogard, for all his losses, had not come to Thorngate merely to play cards. He had come to set a trap. 1847 Virginia. 4 men, 1 storm. The cards had only just begun to fall. If you were sitting at that table, watching Marcus Bogard lose his fortune, would you keep pressing your luck, or would you sense the danger in his smile? By 10 o'clock, the study at Thorngate had turned thick with heat and smoke. The storm outside drummed against the tall windows, rain streaking down the glass like black ink. On the table, stacks of coins and bills lay scattered across the felt, testimony to Harrison's triumph and Marcus Bogard's unraveling. Marcus had lost nearly $800, and yet his expression was not despair. It was something sharper, a predator's patience. He shuffled the deck with practiced grace, his long fingers dancing over the cards as though they were instruments only he knew how to play. "Gentlemen," Marcus said finally, his voice smooth as the bourbon in his glass, "I fear these stakes no longer amuse me. Shall we make the game unforgettable?" Judge Peaton stiffened. Dr. Fitzgerald frowned. Even Harrison's hand paused midway to his glass. Caesar, moving to refill the decanter, slowed just enough for his silence to carry weight. "What did you have in mind?" Harrison asked, though some part of him already feared the answer. Marcus leaned forward, the firelight catching in his eyes. "We gamble for what truly matters. For bloodlines. For legacies." He let the words settle like ash before speaking the unthinkable. "I propose you place your daughter, Margaret Rutherford, as collateral." The room froze. The crackle of the fire seemed deafening in the silence. Judge Peaton's face went pale, and Fitzgerald let out an audible gasp. Caesar's grip on the crystal decanter trembled, though his face remained still. Harrison laughed, though it came out hollow. "You jest." "Do I?" Marcus asked calmly. "Marriage is already an arrangement of wealth and advantage. Fathers bargain their daughters to secure fortune, property, alliances. Why not let the cards decide instead of whispers behind parlors?" Judge Peaton's voice trembled with outrage. "Marcus, this is obscene. A young woman's life is not to be shuffled into a deck." "And yet," Marcus countered, "isn't that what we all do in one form or another? You barter her future with suitors you approve. Why not place her fate where fortune can speak?" Harrison's jaw tightened. Pride and bourbon warred with reason. To refuse might look like weakness. To accept, well, what were the odds? He had been winning all night. His hand, his luck, his pride all told him the gods themselves were on his side. "Margaret is my most precious possession," Harrison said slowly. "What would you place against her?" Marcus' smile curved, sharp, predatory. "The one thing you value nearly as much, Caesar." The decanter shook in Caesar's hand. Now the silence carried weight enough to crush a man. Harrison felt the room tilt, his empire itself shifting under his feet. His daughter, his enslaved bookkeeper, both reduced to stakes in a single game. And yet, the more impossible it sounded, the more tempting it became. Because for Harrison, this was not just about fortune. It was about dominance. To wager Margaret was to prove he was fearless. To win Caesar was to secure, forever, the one mind he could never truly control. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous, "this will not be a game. This will be history, 1847 Virginia. A daughter's hand, a slave's life, and one master's pride turning into his noose. If you were Margaret, your father's fortune in a deck of cards, what would you pray for? His victory or his ruin?" The storm outside deepened, rattling the tall glass panes as if the heavens themselves recoiled at the stakes. Inside Thorngate's study, the fire burned low, casting shadows across the green felt table where men had now placed human lives as chips. Marcus Beauregard's challenge still hung in the air. Caesar Wellington, enslaved, literate, indispensable, wagered like a horse. Like a coin, Judge Peaton slammed his hand on the table. "This goes beyond gambling. Harrison, you cannot," but Harrison raised a palm, silencing him. The bourbon had thickened his blood, and pride clouded his reason. He stared at Caesar, who stood motionless by the brandy table, his face unreadable. "Caesar is worth more than any plantation," Harrison said, almost to himself. "His mind has built my fortune. His ledgers are sharper than steel." His eyes narrowed. "If I wager him, it is no small thing." Marcus leaned back, a predator satisfied. "Exactly. A daughter's hand, an enslaved man's genius. Equal stakes, and fortune will choose." Caesar's heart pounded, though his body betrayed nothing. His hands, the same hands that had balanced accounts, drafted contracts, counted every dollar earned on others' backs, now trembled as they reached for the deck. "Yes," Marcus said softly, his smile curling like smoke. "Let him deal. Who better to ensure fairness than the one whose life depends on the cards?" The irony was crueler than any whip. Caesar, denied freedom all his life, would now hold the power to shuffle it into existence, or deal himself deeper into chains. He took the cards. The paper felt rough against his fingertips, heavy with the sweat of centuries. He shuffled once, twice, his hands steadying with each motion. In that moment, he was both invisible servant and silent judge. Harrison poured another glass of bourbon, masking the dryness in his mouth. "Very well. Caesar deals." Judge Peaton pushed back from the table. "I'll not be part of this madness." "Then observe," Marcus said smoothly. "Your presence ensures the terms are witnessed." The judge remained, but his face had turned the color of ash. The cards snapped in Caesar's hands, crisp against the storm's thunder. Each shuffle was a heartbeat. Each cut a verdict. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice low, almost reverent. "One hand. Winner takes all." The room held its breath. As Caesar dealt the first card, a thought echoed in his mind. Every number, every suit, every chance had been used to measure him as property. Tonight, for the first time, those same numbers might measure something else. Justice. But justice, Caesar knew, could be cruel. Virginia. A father's pride, a daughter's fate, a slave's trembling hands shuffling the deck of destiny. If you were Caesar, forced to deal the cards of your own life, would you stack them in your favor, or let fortune decide? The storm clawed at the windows, thunder rolling like drums of war. Inside the study, all eyes fixed on Caesar's hands. The enslaved man sat at the head of the table, shuffling with slow, deliberate motions. His face was a mask, but his eyes burned with a quiet calculation no one noticed, or perhaps no one dared to name. 5-card stud, Marcus Bogard declared. One hand. Winner takes all. Caesar cut the deck and began to deal. Harrison's first down card slid across the felt, followed by his face-up card, the king of spades. A strong start. His lips curled in satisfaction. Marcus received the jack of diamonds face-up, his down card hidden. The second round fell. Harrison drew the king of hearts, a visible pair gleaming on the green felt. Marcus drew the queen of diamonds, building towards something dangerous. The room shifted, breath-catching. Pair of king's bets, Caesar announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison shoved $500 into the pot, nearly half his evening's winnings. Marcus matched without flinching, his eyes fixed on Harrison's face, not the cards. The third round. Harrison drew the 10 of spades. 2 pairs, kings and tens, strong, very strong. Marcus flipped the 10 of diamonds, with a jack, queen, and 10 of diamonds showing. Whispers of a straight flush danced in the air. The tension became unbearable. The fire cracked, but no one moved. All in, Harrison said, pushing the rest of his fortune into the center. His voice trembled with pride, not doubt. He was certain destiny favored him. Marcus matched, his smile slow, deliberate. Call. The final cards. Harrison's last was the king of clubs. A full house. Kings over tens. A hand so strong it would win 99 games out of 100. Triumph surged through his veins. He nearly laughed. He had risked his daughter, and fortune had crowned him with power. Marcus turned his card over. The 8 of diamonds. A silence fell sharper than any blade. Marcus's hand lay before them. 8, 9, 10. Jack. Queen of diamonds. A straight flush. One of the rarest hands in poker. Harrison's laughter died in his throat. His face drained of color. Judge Peaton gripped his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Dr. Fitzgerald's lips parted in disbelief. Caesar alone remained still, though in his eyes flickered something no one else caught. Not fear, not sorrow, but certainty. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice soft but heavy as a funeral bell. Gentlemen, I believe we have a winner. Harrison stared at his full house, a hand fit for victory, now reduced to ash. His daughter's fate, his pride, his empire, all lost in a single card's cruel justice. In that moment, Thorngate Manor cracked. Not in stone, but in blood, 47 Virginia. 1 full house, 1 straight flush. A daughter lost, a slave claimed, a master broken. If you were Harrison watching your full house crumble against fate itself, would you call it chance or punishment? Dawn broke gray and heavy over Thorngate Manor. Rain still clung to the fields, soaking the tobacco rows until they sagged like weeping giants. Inside the house, the study smelled of smoke and stale bourbon, its green felt table still scarred by the night's hand of ruin. Harrison Rutherford sat slumped in the same chair, eyes hollow, staring at the cards that had destroyed him. When the household stirred awake, whispers spread quickly. The master had lost something terrible. Caesar moved silently through the corridors, carrying the weight of knowledge in his chest. He knew this morning would not end quietly. Harrison found Margaret in the morning room, dressed in pale blue silk, a book of poetry open before her. The sunlight caught the auburn of her hair, setting it aflame, but her face softened when she saw him. "Papa, you look dreadful," she said. "Were you awake all night?" He sat across from her, his hands trembling as he tried to speak, words jammed in his throat, choking him with their shame. "Margaret, my dear, something happened last night. Something I never intended." Her green eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Harrison inhaled, then forced the words out like knives. "I wagered your future, your hand in marriage, and I lost." For a moment, Margaret didn't move. The world seemed to pause, the ticking clock on the mantel the only sound. Then her lips parted, not in disbelief but in fury. "You... what?" Her voice cut the air like steel. Harrison's eyes filled with tears he had never shown another soul. "It was one hand, Margaret. I had a full house. The odds, I don't care about the odds." Her voice rose, each word sharper than the last. "You sold me. Like property. Like one of your fields." Harrison tried to reach for her hand. She pulled it back as if his touch burned. "I am not a chip in your games. I am not your coin to trade. You've given me to that man." "That stranger?" "Marcus Bogart is wealthy. Connected, he will never have me." The coldness in her voice silenced him. Her fury was not the wild rage of a child, but the calm, dangerous anger of a woman wronged. She stood, her chair scraping hard against the floor. "You may force me to marry him under Virginia's laws, but hear me, Papa, you cannot force me to love him. You cannot force me to bear his children. You cannot force me to be his. I will spend every day of that marriage making him regret the moment he sat at your table." The fire of her mother's spirit burned in her eyes, a flame Harrison had never seen so clearly until this moment. She turned for the door. "Tell Marcus Bogart that if he wants a bride, he has won himself a prison. And tell yourself, Papa, that you have lost me." The door shut behind her and Harrison crumbled into silence, knowing his daughter was right. He had not only gambled her future, he had gambled away her trust, her love, her soul. 47 Virginia. A daughter betrayed, a father broken, and fury that burned hotter than fire. If you were Margaret, would you obey the law, or would you fight with every breath against the chains your father forged? The house had grown quieter since dawn, but beneath that silence lay thunder more dangerous than the storm outside. Harrison wandered the corridors like a ghost. Margaret had locked herself in her chamber, and in the study. The cards still sat where fate had fallen. Only one man moved with purpose, Caesar Wellington. He had stood at that table. He had dealt the cards that sealed both his own bondage and Margaret's future. But he had also seen something the others had not: weakness. Pride had driven them blind. Bourbon had loosened their tongues. And while the masters gambled lives, Caesar's sharp mind had been recording every detail, every bet, every word, every witness. That morning, while Harrison sat drowning in shame, Caesar quietly entered his small room in the manor. He opened a wooden box tucked beneath his bed, a box forbidden to exist. Inside lay paper, ink, and letters. For months, Caesar had been secretly corresponding with abolitionists in Richmond. Traders brought newspapers. A sympathetic preacher carried messages. Through those channels, Caesar had learned the power of words written in the right hands. And now he had the perfect story. He dipped his quill into ink and began to write, to the office of the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia. His words were crisp, precise, and undeniable. He detailed how 4 prominent gentlemen, Judge Cornelius Peaton, Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald, Marcus Bogart, and Colonel Harrison Rutherford, engaged in illegal gambling activities. How human lives had been wagered as stakes. How coercion had forced a young woman into marriage. He wrote with the skill of a clerk and the fire of a man who had nothing left to lose. When the first letter was complete, Caesar folded it, sealed it, and slid it into an envelope already addressed, smuggled out that very morning through a stable boy who believed it carried only routine plantation accounts. Then Caesar prepared 3 more letters. These would not go to Richmond's halls of power. They would go to the presses, the Richmond Inquirer, the Charleston Courier, and a Washington paper with abolitionist sympathies. By tomorrow's dawn, if fortune favored him, Virginia society would wake to read headlines more scandalous than any tale of war or murder. Plantation master Bet's daughter in poker game. Slave dealt the cards. Caesar paused, quill in hand. He knew the danger. If discovered, he would face torture, imprisonment, even death. But a thought hardened him. What is life if it is spent as property? He folded the final letter and pressed the wax seal closed. For the first time in his life, he felt not like a pawn moved by another's hand, but like a player, one who had placed his own stake on the table. And unlike his master, Caesar did not intend to lose. 47 Virginia. 1 secret report, 4 powerful men exposed, and a slave who turned ink into a weapon sharper than chains. If you were Caesar, risking death to tell the truth, would you send the letters or burn them to survive another day? By mid-afternoon, Thorngate Manor felt like a house bracing for collapse. The storm had passed, leaving behind dripping eaves and mud-choked roads. But inside the study, the air remained thick with smoke and ruin. Harrison sat slouched, his eyes bloodshot, staring at the signed marriage contract Marcus Bogart had brought that morning. Margaret stood at the window, her back straight as iron, refusing to speak. Caesar lingered by the doorway, silent, waiting. The sudden rattle of carriage wheels cut through the stillness. A knock echoed. Before a servant could answer, the door swung open. Judge Cornelius Peaton entered, his cloak soaked from rain, a parchment gripped tightly in his hand. His face, usually calm with the authority of the law, was grim, almost stricken. "Harrison, Marcus, we have a problem." Bogart straightened in his chair, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What is it, Judge? Come to remind us of last night's terms?" Peaton shook his head. He held up the parchment. The seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia gleamed in red wax. "This arrived at my office not 2 hours ago. A writ of inquiry. The Attorney General's office has been informed of irregular gambling activities, human lives wagered, coercive marriage arrangements." The room froze. Harrison's breath caught. Margaret turned sharply from the window. Marcus's face drained of color. "Impossible," Marcus snapped. "How could they know?" Peaton's eyes moved slowly across the room, past Harrison's hollow stare, past Margaret's burning fury, until they settled on Caesar. The enslaved man did not flinch. His dark eyes met the judge's, calm and unblinking. Harrison's voice rasped. "You reported us?" For the first time in years, Caesar dropped the pretense of obedience. He stepped forward, shoulders straight, voice steady. "Master Harrison, you taught me numbers, accounts, and law. You gave me pen and paper. Did you think I would never use them? I wrote everything. Every bet, every witness, every word. And I sent it to Richmond, to Charleston, to Washington." Marcus surged to his feet, his mask of Southern charm cracking into fury. "You treacherous dog." "Careful, Master Bogart," Caesar said coldly. "The law protects witnesses from assault. Even witnesses you claim as property." Peaton sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "My God, do you understand what this means? An official investigation. The Attorney General himself will demand testimony. This cannot be buried." Harrison's head dropped into his hands. He saw it all unraveling. His land, his fortune, his daughter's future, his reputation. Destroyed not by war or drought, but by a single night's arrogance. Margaret moved to Caesar's side. For the first time, she touched his arm. Her voice was low, fierce, and trembling with gratitude. "You saved me?" Caesar shook his head. "No, Miss Margaret. You would have saved yourself. I simply lit the fire." Marcus paced like a caged animal. "This is ruin. My name will be dragged through papers across the South. Do you even know what you've done?" "Yes," Caesar replied. "For the first time in my life, I chose my own hand to play. And in that moment, Thorngate Manor no longer belonged to its master. It belonged to the truth, 47 Virginia. A writ from Richmond, a secret revealed, and a slave who turned silence into fire. If you were Caesar standing in that room, would you hold your ground or beg for mercy?" Within days, Thorngate Manor ceased to be a home and became something else entirely. A crime scene. Carriages bearing the seal of the Commonwealth lined the muddy drive. Officials in dark coats entered the study with ledgers, quills, and sharp eyes, spreading papers across the same green felt table where lives had been gambled. At their head was Catherine Henley, one of the Attorney General's clerks, a young woman with a voice precise as a blade, and questions that cut deeper than any lash. Her very presence was scandalous, a woman interrogating Virginia's most powerful men. But scandal was the order of the day. She summoned Harrison first. For 6 hours she pressed him, not about tobacco prices or debts, but about his soul. "Help me understand, Colonel Rutherford," she said, her pen scratching across the page. "How does a father justify wagering his daughter's future on the turn of a card? Was it arrogance, desperation, or indifference?" Harrison stammered, sweat soaking through his collar. For the first time in his life, words failed him. Marcus fared worse. Investigators uncovered fraudulent land dealings in Charleston, whispers of illegal slave trading, and a trail of debts he had hidden beneath charm and lies. The poker game was not his first attempt to seize a bride through manipulation. Virginia society recoiled, branding him a predator cloaked in silk. Judge Peaton, once the pride of the Commonwealth, found himself cornered by his own principles. He had helped write the very laws he now stood accused of violating. His reputation, built over decades, crumbled overnight, and Dr. Fitzgerald, he turned witness. With trembling hands, he corroborated Caesar's account. The wagers, the witnesses, the coercion. His cooperation spared him prison, but cost him everything else. Families shunned his medical practice. Neighbors whispered. Patients vanished. But the investigation's sharpest weapon was Caesar himself. Brought before the officials, the enslaved man spoke with a calm that unsettled his interrogators. He described not just the game, but the rot beneath it. A system where men of wealth treated daughters as coin and slaves as tools, their arrogance blind to consequence. His testimony was clear, his language precise, his presence undeniable. Master Rutherford didn't wager his daughter out of desperation, Caesar said, voice steady. He wagered her because losing her would prove his power. And Marcus Bogard didn't seek a wife. He sought ownership of a soul. The words spread like wildfire, because Caesar's letters had reached their destinations. By the time the Attorney General's men concluded their interviews, newspapers were already printing the scandal. Virginia planter's wager daughter in game of cards. Slave deals justice with a deck, the hand that shamed the South. Across plantations, parlors and taverns, men whispered. Women wept. Some dismissed it as lies, others as blasphemy, but none could ignore it. The story of Thorngate was no longer Harrison's to bury. It belonged to the people, to the rumor mills, the gossip, the outrage. The empire he had built on silence was drowned beneath a tide of words. 47 Virginia. Courtrooms stirred. Newspapers screamed. One night's game became a scandal the South could not hide. If you had been Caesar, watching your words spread across Virginia, would you feel triumph? Or fear for what would come next? The scandal that began at a card table now thundered through Virginia's courts, plantations, and parlors. The four men who once styled themselves pillars of the Commonwealth stood stripped of their power, their reputations collapsing like rotten beams under rain. Marcus Bogard fell first. Investigators uncovered ledgers from Charleston that exposed him as more than a gambler. He was a fraud, a predator, a man who bought and sold lives outside even the brutal laws of the South. His rice holdings were illusions, his fortune a facade built on illegal slave trading. When his trial concluded, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The newspapers called him the gentleman wolf, a creature cloaked in silk but feeding on flesh. He lasted only 3 years behind bars before dying of pneumonia, though whispers said another inmate ended him with a pillow pressed in the night. Judge Cornelius Peaton's fall was quieter, but no less devastating. The man who had helped draft Virginia's Constitution now faced the shame of being complicit in wagering human lives. Though spared prison, he was forced to resign in disgrace. He moved from grand courthouses to a small office where he handled petty disputes over fences and debts. The law he once shaped no longer respected his name. Neighbors whispered he died of a broken heart, shamed by the very system he had betrayed. Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald fared differently. His guilt was the lightest, yet his punishment cut deepest. He chose to cooperate with investigators, testifying against the others, his words sealing Marcus's fate. But cooperation could not cleanse reputation. Families no longer trusted his hands on their sick children, and his once thriving medical practice shriveled. He became a shadow, a physician with no patients, a neighbor with no friends. And Harrison Rutherford? His punishment was not swift but slow, stretched across years like a noose tightening inch by inch. He faced crippling legal fees, civil penalties, and the collapse of his business partnerships. The tobacco markets, once swayed by his word, now turned cold. His name, once a seal of influence, became a stain. The mighty Thorngate plantation, built across 3 generations, was carved apart piece by piece. Acres sold off to cover debts until only fragments remained. But worse than ruin was shame. Harrison could no longer walk into county halls without whispers. The man who gambled his daughter. Invitations ceased. Friendships dissolved. Even his allies abandoned him. The proud colonel of Virginia became a recluse, a man living inside the very ruins he had created. And through it all, Caesar remained. Not as property now, his legal fate hung suspended, but as presence, as reminder. Harrison could not look upon him without remembering the hand he had lost. The empire he had shattered. What had once been a Thursday night ritual among gentlemen ended as a curse that followed each of them to the grave. Wait in Virginia. 4 men at a table, 4 men undone. Pride had shuffled the deck, but justice dealt the hand. If you could decide their fates, Marcus, Harrison, Peyton, Fitzgerald, would you punish them with prison or with ruin? By 1850, 3 years after the scandal, Thorngate Manor was a shadow of itself. Half the land had been sold, the great house weather-stained, its white columns graying with neglect. Harrison Rutherford lived there still. But as a diminished man, his voice absent from courts, his name erased from politics, his pride replaced by silence. But Margaret had grown stronger. On her 21st birthday, she stood in the Richmond courthouse, her auburn hair pinned high, her dark blue gown tailored not for beauty but for authority. In her hand she held a deed, her inheritance from her mother's estate, money Harrison could not touch. And with it she made her decision. Today, she declared before the clerk, I purchase the freedom of Caesar Wellington. The papers were drawn and signed, the seal of the Commonwealth pressed into wax. Caesar, now 38, received them with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of history. For the first time he held proof that he was no longer property. The courthouse murmured as word spread. Reporters scribbled, abolitionists nodded, and Harrison, absent though his shadow lingered, could not stop it. The transaction was public, irreversible, permanent. When Margaret handed the papers to Caesar, she spoke with steady fire. You are free. No man will wager you again. And as for me, I will never marry. I will not trade one master for another. Caesar bowed his head, not as servant, but as equal. Miss Margaret, your courage is worth more than freedom. It is the future. From that day forward, they forged an unlikely partnership. Margaret refused every suitor who came knocking, turning away wealthy sons of Virginia with a cold smile. She poured her inheritance into ventures with Caesar, property deals, trade accounts, and investments that defied every expectation. A planter's daughter and a freedman running business together. It was scandal, defiance, rebellion, and yet it worked. Caesar's brilliance in numbers, paired with Margaret's social standing and iron will, built an enterprise that mocked the ruins of Thorngate. While Harrison watched his empire crumble, his daughter and his former slave built one anew, not with chains, but with contracts. For Virginia's elite, this was humiliation beyond repair. For Caesar and Margaret, it was justice written in ledgers. The same pen that once recorded debts now recorded freedom. 50 Virginia. One daughter defiant, one man freed. Together, they wrote their own rebellion in ink instead of chains. If you had stood in that courthouse watching Margaret free Caesar, would you have cheered her courage or feared the scandal she unleashed? By 1865, the war had torn Virginia apart. Plantations burned, chains broken, families scattered. Harrison Rutherford did not live to see it. He died in 1863, a bitter and broken man, his once mighty Thorngate reduced to fragments. Margaret buried him without ceremony. For her, the poker game had killed her father long before death claimed his body. Caesar Wellington lived on, not as property, not as a servant, but as a voice. In the first spring after emancipation, he published his memoir, From Property to Person, My Journey from Slavery to Freedom. The book spread through the North like wildfire, reprinted in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Even in the South, copies found their way into hidden corners, passed from hand to hand in whispers. Inside, Caesar revealed truths no court had heard. He described Thorngate in detail. The fields, the ledgers, the arrogance of men who treated daughters and slaves as equal stakes on the same table. But his most shocking revelation was this. He had rigged the deal. I dealt Marcus Bogard the winning hand, he wrote. I gave him the 8 of diamonds, because I knew that if Harrison won, Margaret and I would remain chained forever. Her to marriage, me to bondage. But if Marcus won, the outrage would be too great to hide. Virginia could bury a scandal of debt. It could not bury a scandal of flesh, readers gasped. Caesar had turned the very tools of his oppression, the cards, the silence, the law, into his rebellion. He had sacrificed certainty for chaos, knowing chaos would shatter the system. Margaret wrote no memoir, but she stood by Caesar's side until her death, refusing every suitor, every offer, every temptation to conform. She became one of Virginia's first women to own property in her own right, one of the earliest voices whispering about rights not yet recognized. Together, they had rewritten the legacy of Thorngate, but the house itself was never free. In the decades after Harrison's death, new owners swore the study was haunted, cards shuffled in the silence of night, voices whispered in the dark. Some claimed to hear a woman's defiance, others the calm voice of a man shuffling justice into the deck. Historians later called it the Caesar-Wellington precedent. Lawyers studied it as the case that first cracked Virginia's paternal authority laws. Reformers cited it as proof that even within the system of slavery, resistance found ways to bend the law against itself. But the story that endured was simpler, darker. A master wagered his daughter. A stranger claimed her, and the enslaved man forced to deal the cards dealt history instead. Even now, the question lingers like smoke. Was Caesar's act justice or vengeance? 1847 Virginia. One hand of cards, one daughter betrayed, one man freed, and a system shaken by ink, fire, and silence. What do you think? Did Caesar reveal the whole truth, or are there still secrets buried in Virginia's archives? Share your thoughts below. And if you want more buried history like this, subscribe and join us again. The past still has shadows left to uncover,